All right, we're back. UFC Fight Night, Whittaker versus Gastelum, and pretty tricky card to navigate, in my opinion. Really low level fights all over this card. Honestly, I'd say outside of the main and the co main, most of these other matchups are pretty low level. I mean, obviously, there are going to be some exceptions, but by and large, this is a pretty weak card. Not going to dwell on it too much, though. I'm just hoping the 261 card stays intact and delivers. But before we get into this card, I do want to jump into the recap for the previous card. So as far as pick goes, I only went 8 out of 13 correct. And from a betting perspective, I did lose 1 in at 1.04 units on the night. So once again, I showed my true degenerate self. After the Daukaus fight fell through, I ended up pulling the trigger on Perry and Alvey, which, big mistakes in hindsight. But, I did feel that Alvey had a bit of a shot against Marquez, who seemed a little overvalued in that fight. I never thought that Marquez was that good, but Alvey just looked really slow out there, and I think being at 185 is going to be a big difference for him. Because at least at 205, even though he was a smaller guy, he'd be much quicker, would be able to beat guys to the punch. But even against someone like Marquez, who is, in my opinion, a pretty slow 185er, Alvey wasn't able to keep up with him. So, I think Alvey's more or less done. I don't know if the UFC is going to keep him around, but it's going to be really hard betting on him going forward. Not that it wasn't for this fight, but I thought that the way with Marquez moves forward, he'd eventually get caught with one of those hooks. But he was able to consistently beat Alvey to the punch and played a really smart game plan in my opinion. So good on him for getting it done. And then as for the Perry play, while he did look bad in his last two fights, I kind of just chalked it up to him not really having a training camp or, a corner or really doing any sort of training outside of just hitting pads with his girlfriend. With his recent move to, MMA Masters, I figured, he'd return to a bit of his older form, but it looks like Perry's just completely shot in there. He looks so slow, looks so stiff, and just gave a really, really poor account of himself. And while he did go to the grappling, it wasn't enough to get anything done. Kind of got blew out in that fight, got outclassed pretty badly, and don't want to overreact to it, but I don't know how much of a future Perry has left in the UFC because it seems like he's been on quite a decline after that Luque fight, and I can see it. He's taken so much damage in his career, even though it's been pretty short. But moving on, taking a look at some of the other props that I didn't hit. I took the Jordan Griffin fight under 2.5 rounds, put a unit on that. I thought that both guys would come out a little bit stronger, and with both guys having pretty spotty defense, I thought that someone would get clipped or get caught with the submission, and it looked like on a few occasions it might have come close, but ultimately I think both guys played it pretty safe, and I just got to say Griffin might be done in the UFC as well. He's had a really disappointing run, and in a fight where I think he needed to really make a stamp, he just kind of coasted. Do I think he should have won? Probably. It was a really close fight, but for someone who's I think on the hot seat, he's didn't really give a great account of himself. And then some other props I put a little sprinkle on was Perry by decision. Obviously, that didn't materialize. I felt that if he were to win this, it'd likely be a boxing affair. Pretty close on the feet with him looking to maybe score some takedowns to, win the round. And as for Alvey, obviously, and I thought that Marquez would just kind of walk into a hook or Alvey would land one of his counters as Marquez was coming in. But Marquez, he stayed sharp that fight, so good for him. And then lastly, Jack Shore round 3 submission. It looked like everyone was all over that prop, but the idea behind that was, Algeo would tire a little bit, give his back, Jack Shore get the hooks in or get the body triangle and then eventually get the rear naked choke. But Algeo held up in there, and Shore won the decision. Not too surprising there, just wanted to take a small stab on the round 3 sub. And then I also put a little bit on a McDessie by decision that fight. I kind of had a feeling that this would be a pretty close fight. Bahamondes, he looked really good that fight. He looked really good in his previous fights, but like I was saying before, these guys, they look good against really low-level competition and, against someone who's much more technical in McDessie. I felt the fight would, play out much closer than the line indicated, so I just put a little bit on, the decision prop, and, McDessie, he had me sweating a little bit in that first round when it looked like he hurt Bahamondes, but, knowing McDessie, he doesn't really finish anyone, doesn't really have any sort of killer instinct or anything, striking. So yeah, he was able to get out a decision there in a really close fight. So glad that cashed. And then the other fights that cashed obviously were the Jack Shore and then the Dao Jung fight where, I was just really looking to fade Knight, and that was a good read. I feel like everyone was all over, or not everyone, but there was a lot of people who were all over Knight, thinking he would just be able to outmuscle Dao Jung. But like I was saying, man, Knight he's terrible. He doesn't have really any technique and just relies on exploding out of positions or just muscling opponents to the ground. But that's not really going to work once you start facing guys who can kind of match your power and are much more technical, and you're not able to just muscle these guys to the ground. And the fact that he got taken down by the same trip like 3, 4, 5 times in the same fight just really shows you how low level he really is. And yeah, Dao Jung was able to just coast to a decision there. Not in the way I expected. I thought he'd box him up a little more, but it was a good fade on Knight. He just had no answer to Dao Jung's ground game. And so, yeah, that'll wrap it up for the recap. Again, just ended up losing 1.04 units on the night. Should have just stayed off of the parry and Alvi plays and come out ahead, but, it is what it is. I'm a true degenerate, but, yeah, let's get right into this Bellator. And kicking off the card, we have Tony Gravely versus Anthony Birchak. And yeah, let's start with Gravely here. So Gravely, he's primarily a wrestler. He's got good takedowns, timing on level changes, and pretty good top control as well. He's a pretty strong guy. I've seen him slam guys, but a lot of the time I see him working takedowns along the cage. As far as his striking goes, though, he's pretty basic. Really only throwing 1 or 2 shots at a time. Does get a little wild occasionally, and is a bit hittable and is rather slow. But like I was saying, though, he's primarily a grappler, so he's really just going to look to get this fight to the ground as soon as he can. And something I did notice about him is the cardio is a little suspect. He does slow down, quite a bit later in the fight, but he has been getting it done. And, with his grapple-heavy game plan, it does tire opponents out a bit too. So, the guy, he's been gutting it out, so I can't hold it too much against him, but that is something to consider going into future fights. But I don't think it's going to matter too much in this one. I don't think he'll have too much of an issue dealing with Birchak here. Birchak isn't really high level or anything, and I don't really think that Birchak's going to be able to push Gravely. But taking a look at Birchak, he's got decent movement on the feet, good footwork, but he's just really slow, and it makes sense for someone who's 34 at the 135 division. While that's not very old in general, it's kind of old for the division, and he's going to have a pretty sizable, I'd say, speed and strength disadvantage here. Gravely, he's going to be the much younger guy who's on the upswing of his career. And, for Birchak, while I think he is the better striker here, he is, I think, a bit more grapple heavy himself. And going against someone like Gravely, who is, I'd say, the better wrestler here, he's going to really struggle getting his game going. The only way, outside of a, fluky knockout or submission from Birchak, I don't see him having much of an opportunity to win here. Maybe if he's able to keep it standing, he could look to just strike with Gravely and make it a close fight, but I don't see that happening. I see Gravely ultimately just getting the fight to the ground, likely controlling Birchak there. Birchak might be able to get up, but a couple times early in the fight, maybe the first round and a half or so, but I really just don't see Birchak having much success in this fight. This is his second UFC stint. His first stint wasn't that good. It was honestly pretty disappointing. And then now that he's come back, I don't think he's really gotten any better. And if anything, I'd say he's on quite a physical decline. So, yeah, I'm going to take Gravely here. And I forgot to bring up the odds, but Gravely's minus 300 favorite, Birchak plus 250 underdog. And, not too much argument from me here. I really just have a hard time seeing Birchak winning this. So the pick here is Gravely, and I think he's a decent parlay piece at this point. I'd say he's a pretty safe pick, outside of him just completely gassing. But I don't think that Birchak is going to be the guy that pushes him to the limit here. So the pick here is Gravely, and no bet just yet, but I might put him in a parlay. We'll see though. And in the next fight, we have Zarah Fairn versus Josiane Nunes. And this is a terrible fight, in my opinion. I really don't know how this fight got on this card. This fight shouldn't even be on an Invicta card, but I'll still break it down anyways. And let's start with Fairn here. And you know what? I take back what I said earlier about her. We got to put some respect on Fairn's name. Yeah, she's got poor striking and leaves her chin out and keeps her hands low, but the only people that have beaten her in the UFC are title contenders. But really, I think that just says more about the state of the women's 145 division. It's honestly a joke. I think if they had rankings, Fairn would probably be ranked like number 7, even though she's a total shit can. But I understand. You got to keep the division around so Nunes can keep her, double champ status, even though I feel like the women's 145 belt is probably as legitimate as the BMF belt. Anyways, I'm done ranting here. I just don't think Fairn is really UFC caliber at all. But she's just getting a shot here, or she's getting a fight because they need to keep this shallow division around. She's very low level. Like I said before, her striking is just awful. And if you've seen any of her fights, you know what I'm talking about. The way she throws her punches, it just looks like someone who's just learned how to strike. I mean, she was getting outboxed by Felicia Spencer, and on the back, she just seemed completely lost too. Got her guard passed pretty easily. Just bum rushed Anderson in her first fight and then got pressed against the cage. Got controlled there. Just does not look good at all in any of her UFC fights. As for her opponent, Nunes, Josiane Nunes, of course, very low level as well. Not too much on the feet. I mean, has Muay Thai base, I guess. Has really heavy leg kicks, loads up a lot on her punches, and just likes to wing hooks against the fence. But overall, her striking is pretty wild in my opinion. As far as her ground game goes, I mean, I've seen her taken down and controlled there. She's not a very big fighter for the division. She's definitely very stocky, kind of short. Could definitely probably cut down to 135 if I'm being honest, but that probably applies to most of the fighters at 145. So it is what it is. But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen too much on Nunes to really give me much confidence in her. This is, again, a very low-level fight. But if I had to make a pick here, I'll just go with Nunes because I really think that Fairn is just awful. She doesn't really bring much to the game here. I think that if Nunes is able to, pressure her a bit, back her up, throw her leg kicks, throw some of those hooks, get her backed up against the fence, and maybe even look to get a takedown on Fairn, I think she could definitely control her there. Although I do have to say she's going to be, I think, giving up a decent amount of size. But again, she's very stocky, so she might be able to just, get on the hip of Fairn and just take her down and just kind of hold her there. But on the feet, I think she's got a bit of an advantage too, since she's going to be, I think, the quicker fighter in there. Fairn, she is also a little older at 34, got into the game pretty late. So I'm gonna go with Nunes here. But this is, again, a very low-level fight, and I'm not looking to bet on it at all. And in the next fight, we have Gerald Meerschaert versus Bartosz Fabinski, and another really subpar fight, in my opinion. Gerald Meerschaert, he's been around in the UFC for a little while now, but isn't that great. He's just had a very, very up and down career so far, and his wins are over guys very low level. So yeah, not very high on Meerschaert, but we know the game plan with Meerschaert. He's going to look to try and get you to the ground, look for the submission. As far as the stand-up goes, I mean, it actually I don't think is too terrible, but against decent strikers he'll struggle. But fundamentally it's not like awful or something. He's just kind of slow, but yeah, he's someone who's much more comfortable on the ground, but on the feet, he'll likely just throw a few jabs, 1-2, we'll throw a few leg kicks, but this guy's really just looking to get the fight to the ground as soon as possible. And I don't think he'll have too much issue getting it there since, his opponent, Fabinski, big lay and pray guy, will look to take his opponents down as soon as possible, lay on top of them, lay a little bit of ground and pound when the ref starts to, push at him a little bit. But, on the ground, he's got decent top control, but it doesn't really throw too much, though, on top. He's really just looking to really just kind of stall on the ground. Like, he's not really even doing too much damage. His work rate will only go up a little bit just so the ref won't break up the fight. But, he's not really doing much damage on top either. But on the feet, Fabinski is he's a total statue. I mean, I've seen fights where he's just literally just standing in front of his opponent for extended periods of time. Really does not have much striking at all. I mean, he will maybe throw a few bombs in there just to kind of close the distance, but not very technique driven or anything, just very wild on the feet and really just looks to close the distance as soon as he can. So yeah, that's what makes this matchup kind of interesting in that regards because, Fabinski, he's going to look to take Meerschaert down. And Meerschaert, he's happy to play off his back. So pretty straightforward fight to break down in that regards. But it's just kind of hard to kind of get a read on, if Meerschaert's going to be able to get the submission or not, because that's really what it's going to hinge on. If Meerschaert's going to win, it'll likely be by submission. Or maybe if Fabinski decides to keep this fight standing and Meerschaert is able to, just kind of pull ahead with the striking. But I think Fabinski is going to look to shoot the takedown. I think he's going to look to try and control Meerschaert. So, I think that's essentially what's going to go down this fight. And, I guess if you're looking to play this fight at all, I think you take Fabinski by decision because he'll either end up laying on top of Meerschaert for 3 rounds. And, Meerschaert, who's content to play off his back, will either just try to hunt submissions all fight and not get it. Or, if he does get the submission, we get, Meerschaert by submission here. So I think the play is either Meerschaert by submission or Fabinski by decision. I don't think there's really much room for in between. However, as far as the pick goes, I'm going to go with Meerschaert. If Fabinski didn't lose by armbar against Munoz, who, going into that fight, I remember thinking, if he could avoid the submission of Munoz, he's probably going to win this fight. But he didn't. He got caught. And, if that's the case there, I think there are going to be opportunities for Meerschaert to catch him. So, I'm going to go with Meerschaert here. I think Meerschaert gets it done by submission. But, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Fabinski just decides to lay on top of Meerschaert and is able to just, keep it chest to chest, play it real safe, and just kind of grind him out for a really boring decision. So the official pick is going to be Meerschaert Meerschaert by submission, but I wouldn't be surprised if Fabinski got the decision here. So I'm probably not going to bet this fight, but if I did, those are the 2 props I'd play. So we'll have to see what the props look like, what the numbers look like for that before I pull the trigger there. But official pick is Meerschaert. Jessica Penne versus Lupita Godina. And another kind of weird fight here. Penne, she was originally scheduled against Hannah Goldie. Hannah Goldie, I think, ended up pulling out, and Godina is stepping in. Godina, let's start with her. I mean, she looks like a decent prospect. She's got pretty good boxing, good counter-striking, and decent footwork. She's looked pretty good in most of the fights I've seen her in. Very aggressive, hits very hard, and overall I'd say is a pretty good striker. That being said, though, she's fought extremely low-level competition, and it's good to look good when you're fighting really low-level fighters. So that is definitely something to consider. And moving on to Penne, she's got decent boxing, likes to move forward, but is generally pretty low output. And, her striking is very basic, mainly just, 1-2, jab, leg kick. And, she has shown that she is able to wrestle, but hasn't really gone to it in her recent fights. And speaking of that, she's coming off of a pretty long layoff. I think like a 4-year layoff. So she could be a little rusty in there. And in her last fight against Danielle Taylor, it was a very, just back and forth fight. It was a fight that she could easily have won too, but never really put a stamp on that fight. But taking a look at this matchup and the odds real quick, Godina, she's going to be a pretty sizable favorite here. Let me take a... so she's going to be the minus 300 favorite. Comeback on Penne is plus 240. And, I just have to say that the line does feel a little wide. While I do think that Godina, she looks good so far, definitely passes the eye test, and I do favor her in this matchup, but I feel like she shouldn't be that big of a favorite, even though it is a Penne who's coming off of a pretty long layoff. So a lot of factors to consider here, but at the end of the day, I just wouldn't be too confident laying minus 300 on a UFC debutante against a UFC veteran in Penne, even though the layoff is a concern. But as far as how the matchup is going to go, I think that if Godina is the one pressuring moving forward, she can have a lot of success because from what I've seen with Penne, she's not as good on her back foot and tends to have her most success when she's the one moving forward. So I think whoever, is taking control of the octagon is going to be the one that's winning the fight. And, something to consider here is Penne is got quite a decent reach advantage on Godina's here. So that could be an issue for her if Godina isn't able to get in the pocket and get her shots off cleanly. If Penne is able to kind of just jab at Godina, keep her at distance, this could be a very close fight. And while the pick here for me is Godinez, I can't help but feel that this is going to be kind of similar to the Bahamondes Makdessi fight earlier, where we have the younger, flashier fighter come in and be a sizable favorite against a veteran of the sport and just come up short. But as far as this fight goes, I think that it could potentially play out much closer than the line would indicate. And I think that if Penne is able to get the respect of Godinez early, then I think this could be potentially a very back and forth fight. And I'm not counting on Penne to use or go to her wrestling, but if she does, she could definitely steal some rounds that way as well. So the official pick for me is going to be Godinez. I favor her just by the virtue of her being the younger, more athletic fighter at this point, probably a bit quicker, and has been more active, but she still needs to be a little more proven before I put any money on her. So the official pick is Godinez, and if I did put any bet on this fight, it would likely be Penne by decision, because if somehow she does make it close, she could potentially just steal a decision here. But I wouldn't put too much on it, since she is coming off that massive layoff and could look just completely washed out there. So we'll see what the odds are on that. But as of right now, the pick is Godinez. But Alexander Romanov versus Juan Espino, and I'd say this is actually a pretty interesting matchup. A bit risky from a betting perspective, but we got two pretty fun heavyweights to watch, in my opinion. So taking a look at Alexander Romanov first, he's very, very strong, very wild fighter. Not very technical on the feet, but this guy will just look to just body slam opponents, get him to the ground, and just unload ground and pound on him. I've seen him throw double hammer fists. This guy's an absolute monster on the ground here. He's got decent top pressure, but I have seen opponents kind of be able to shrimp out or explode out of the bottom in a lot of his fights early. But, as the fight goes on, he's just doing so much damage to them, he's able to get them out of there. However, his striking is really not that good at all, and I think it got a little exposed there in his last fight against Lima, who was beating him up on the feet, in my opinion. But fortunately for Romanov, he was able to just outmuscle De Lima in a lot of scenarios and just eventually get him to the ground, where he was able to actually get the choke. It was a forearm choke. Was able to just sink his forearm right into his neck against the mat and choke him out that way. But Romanov, he's a very exciting, very explosive fighter to watch, but he does rely a bit on his strength, and he can kind of get away with it at the lower level, but I feel like he's going to be fighting a bit more technical opponent in Espino. And with Espino, interesting story about him. Him and Whittaker were actually on The Ultimate Fighter, the most recent Ultimate Fighter, and Whittaker was actually his coach. And Espino, interestingly enough, was really the only fighter that wasn't bitching about the training sessions and was actually doing what Whittaker was kind of coaching the team to do. And he ended up winning the heavyweight tournament. So it's kind of interesting that they're both fighting on the same card now. But taking a look at what he does well, I mean, he's got really slick BJJ. He's quite strong himself as well. He's got, pretty good wrestling and has been able to just run through a lot of guys in the heavyweight division. As far as his striking goes, I mean, he's not super high level with the striking, but I think for the sake of this matchup, he is going to be the better striker. He's a bit lighter on his feet, does like to throw that overhand, but really isn't super layered, though. Does have good feints. Overall, though, I'd say he's an okay striker. It's passable. Definitely, is serviceable enough for him to be able to time that level change and eventually get that fight to the ground. And on the ground, he's got pretty good top control. Again, very slick BJJ. And he's able to hit transitions pretty well. Is pretty active with the submissions, but will lay the ground and pound as well. As far as the matchup goes, though, we do have to look at the odds real quick, actually. So Alexander Romanov, he's going to be the minus 137 favorite. And the comeback on Espino is plus 117. And, I'm not going to argue with this too much. I do favor Espino a little more. I like Espino in the sense that I think he's going to be the better fighter. I think just He's much more well-rounded, much more technical. The only issue that I have with him is he's kind of old. He's 40 years old. He's only had 10 fights though, so he's not like got a ton of wear and tear or anything. But biologically at 40, I know for heavyweight the shelf life is a little bit longer. But he's fighting a really big, strong, physical guy in Romanov, and while Espino, he's pretty strong himself. He's been fighting relatively low-level guys and has been able to kind of bully them around. And I think for the first time, he'll be going up against someone who can match his physicality and likely will be, stronger than him in this matchup. And I definitely do think that Romanov will be able to get Espino to the ground. Although I think Espino will put up a good fight. He'll defend really well and, might be able to explode out of positions early. He might even be able to threaten with some submissions, but overall this will be a pretty tough fight for Espino in my opinion. That being said, though, I don't think this will be an easy fight for Romanov as well. I think on the feet, again, I think Espino's got him beat. And then as far as, getting the fight to the ground, Espino is going to be dangerous there too. And we haven't really seen Romanov defend a takedown either. So, if Espino is the one initiating the grappling, he might have a bit of success there as well. And something to consider with Romanov as well is I don't think he's gone to a decision in any of his pro fights. This guy's able to get most of his opponents out of there early in the fight. I think there's only one fight where he went into the third round, or two fights actually that's gone into the third round. But this guy's a finisher, and the gas tank kind of concerns me a bit. He hasn't really shown to really gas in his fights, but at the same time, he's beating up these really low-level guys, aren't able to put up much resistance, and he's not overexerting himself. And with how wild he is on the ground, I don't think he could be throwing these double hammer fists on Espino and not tire himself out. I think Espino is going to look to fight the hands, look to sweep, and honestly just put up a lot more resistance than any of the fighters that Romanov has fought recently. Like, if you just look through some of the Romanov's previous opponents, I mean, these guys are just extremely bloated, light heavyweights or even middleweights. So, he's fighting really unathletic, low-level guys. And Espino, I'd say he's an actual heavyweight, and he's actually got a well-rounded skill set. So I think Espino is going to give him a tough fight here. And as far as a pick goes, I'm going to go with Espino. I'm going to go, he is a bit older, but I'm going to go with the guy who's, just the more technical fighter, the guy who's actually got, a decent skill set. I think that if Romanov isn't able to get him out of there early with the ground and pound, maybe within the first round and a half or so, I could see Espino, just weathering the storm and putting it on Romanov later in the fight, because I'm not convinced that Romanov really can fight at that pace for 3 rounds. So I see Espino possibly winning, the later round, maybe even getting a submission in the later round if Romanov starts to tire a lot. But I can't say for certain because we really haven't seen Romanov, tested into the later rounds, and we haven't really seen the same for Espino either. It's been he gets most of his finishes in the first round as well, and this will be a pretty interesting fight. But the pick here is going to be Espino, and as far as the bet goes, likely not going to play the money line. Maybe look for that round 3 prop for Espino. But yeah, moving on. Tracy Cortez versus Justine Kish. And let's start with Cortez here. On the feet, she's got really sloppy boxing, in my opinion. Just lowers her head, blitzes in, and, swings a little wild with her hooks and is extremely hittable as well. But, she is primarily a grappler, looks to, wrestle her opponents, get them to the ground. She's got a decent single or double leg, but will look to trip opponents against the cage. And, she's got decent top control. Decent ground and pound, but her game is still very unpolished in my opinion. Honestly, I'm not really sold on her just yet. Like, she's beaten some other notable prospects like Blanchfield and Agapova, but she honestly didn't look great in those performances. And overall, just haven't really been impressed with her performances. But, with her skill set, she's always able to make fights pretty close and is able to control opponents for extended periods of time. That being said, though, she's being fed a pretty softball matchup in Justine Kish. I mean, Kish has had a very unimpressive UFC run. Her striking really isn't much to write home about, and she will go to her grappling a bit to win rounds and control her opponents, but As far as this matchup goes, I mean, I guess she's a little lighter on her feet. Her striking might be a little bit better than Cortez, but it's hard to get a really good read on her since, she's fought some decent level of, opposition in the UFC, or at least, UFC caliber opponents, which, if in my opinion, honestly isn't saying too much either in this division. But, she's been able to hang with, fighters like Felice Serig, Ashley Yoder, Nina Nunes. And so, against someone like Cortez, she might give a better account of herself, in terms of like the striking. But as far as the grappling goes, I'd say Cortez would have the advantage here. I think that, if Cortez is able to get Kish to the ground, she can make it a very, sloppy fight. Kish, she's not just going to give up on the ground, though. She'll look to fight out of it. But I'm just not really sold on Cortez to say that she wins very dominantly. I think that there's going to be a lot of, scrambling situations on the ground, and on the feet, I see it being a pretty sloppy fight too, honestly. But yeah, taking a look at the odds here, I think Cortez is a pretty sizable favorite. Yeah, she's a minus 260 favorite. Comeback on Kish is plus 220. Yeah, I don't really agree with that. I think it should be a bit closer. Cortez, like I said before, while she does look decent, in a lot of, her fights, she's got a lot of control time. She's been fighting really low level opponents, and I think that she's got to be a little more proven before laying, minus 260 on her. So I'm going to pick her to win. I think that, overall, she will be able to get enough control time to win in the judges' eyes, but not someone I'd like to put money on at this point. So the official pick is going to be Cortez. I think she's able to grind it out. But this is a pretty hard pass from a betting perspective. Ricardo Ramos versus Bill Algeo. And this is a pretty interesting fight here. But let's start with Ramos here. So, I mean, his striking, I'm not very impressed with. It's, rather basic. He does have really good straight punches, and, he keeps it real tight, which I do like. But outside of that, I've not really been impressed with him. He's pretty low volume as well, and I really have to question his fight IQ, though. I've seen time and time again, him going to the well with the spinning attacks, and, there was this really weird spinning, back foot tap that he was doing. I really don't know what the deal with that was. I don't know what he was going for. I think, best case scenario, you hurt the guy's foot a little bit, but when he's doing that, he's leaving himself exposed, and, it was really interesting, kind of flashy the first time I saw it, but after the third or fourth time, it got old. And Bisping was saying it real well, that was just a very, very low IQ move. It was a very high risk, low reward maneuver, and he threw it 4 or 5 times. And outside of that, he's also a bit of a coaster. In his fight against Journey Newsom, I remember Newsom was coming in short notice, and Ramos, he was just playing it real safe in that fight, just kind of pitter-pattering him, and never really put a stamp on that fight, and just gave a really lackluster performance. And his opponent, Bill Algeo, so he's got pretty wild striking in my opinion, kind of hittable, although he does do a pretty good job mixing it up on the feet, and I have noticed that he likes to move forward, and generally has shown decent cardio. But in his fight against, I believe, Lugnane, he slowed down quite a bit in that third round and was getting touched up pretty badly. But that said, though, that was a pretty high-paced fight, and he did show a bit more composure in more recent fights, and seems to pace himself a little better and not gas out later in the fight. But I like that Algeo seems to have a pretty well-rounded game. Outside of his striking, he does have a pretty decent clinch game, good clinch knees and elbows. And, has decent scrambles and takedown defense. Seems to have good, BJJ as well. And, has decent offensive grappling as well. I mean, just overall pretty well-rounded. But, yeah, I'd say he's given a pretty good account of himself wherever the fight has gone. And I think the fight that obviously really stood out was his fight against Ricardo Lamas, where he came in short notice and actually put up a hell of a fight. And that's why I do favor Algeo a little more in this matchup. As far as the odds go, it's a pick'em fight right now, minus 110 both ways. And, Algeo, what I like about him is, he'll fight for your money. This guy, he'll bring it. He'll look to pressure, look to always bring the fight to his opponent. And I think that's what'll win him the fight. I think it's his pressure and his volume will likely be what edges it out on the judges' scorecard. I think that Ramos, he might be the quicker, more athletic fighter. I think that, if he's the one initiating, he might be able to get some of his shots off earlier on Algeo here. But I think Algeo can make this a really just grindy sort of fight. Look to, dirty box with him a bit, push him up against the cage. And even in some of the striking exchanges, Algeo, he's not afraid to take a few shots to land some of his own. So I think he'll give a really good account of himself. I think this will be a pretty back and forth fight, but I'm going to edge it off for Algeo because of the aggression and the pressure and the pace. And I think that, again, he is the more well-rounded fighter. So, if he starts falling behind in some of the striking, I think that he'll look to clinch up with Ramos. And with some of Ramos's tendencies, I think he'll leave himself open to, eating some clean shots against Algeo. So the pick here is Algeo, and I likely will be betting him too. I haven't locked anything in yet, but I'm going to wait and see how the line moves and dig a little deeper on this, but I do favor Algeo here. So again, the pick is Algeo, and I will possibly look to maybe put a unit and a half on him. And moving right along, we have Alex Munoz versus Luis Pena. And let's start with Pena first. So, Pena, his striking is decent. Nothing crazy. He's got a good jab, good, straight left, front kick, flying knee, knee up the middle. He manages his distance pretty well, but he's not a very layered striker or anything. He's just able to do the fundamentals pretty well, in my opinion. Does have a bit of the tall men's defense. He relies a lot on pulling his head back, and we have seen him clipped a number of times. But yeah, I mean, his striking is serviceable, but as we've seen in his fight against Kamaworthy here, he does tend to struggle against, someone who's primarily a striker. I'd say that Pena excels a bit more with in his grappling. His wrestling isn't particularly good, but he does have, decent BJJ. He's got good back takes, a good body triangle that he likes to do. He really likes to, backpack opponents. Yeah, I've seen fights where he's just spent whole rounds just backpacking and controlling opponents. Defensively, he does seem to have okay takedown defense. He does threaten with submissions and is decent at scrambling. As far as his opponent goes, though, Alex Munoz, he's primarily a wrestler. Not too much to offer on the feet. And we did see him get absolutely, just boxed up by Haqparast, but Haqparast, pretty high-level striker in my opinion. But yeah, Munoz, decent jab, hooks, overhand, very basic striking, but, he's really just looking to shoot the takedown, lay on top of his opponent, land a bit of ground and pound. And he is fighting out of a decent camp in, Team Alpha Male. Very, wrestle heavy camp there. So, he's probably getting a ton of good looks. But as far as his matchup goes, I do have a slight lean towards Pena. He does have, a bit more UFC experience, but taking a look at just the matchup, I think that Pena, he'll be a little better on the feet. I think he'll have, better distance management. I think he should be able to kind of touch up Munoz, although Munoz probably will be landing the heavier shots. But I definitely do see Munoz shooting a takedown eventually. I think that Pena, he'll be able to fight off a lot of the takedowns. He'll be able to scramble in a lot of those situations. And, he does have to be careful of the jump knees or the flying knees from Pena. And, he will go to those quite a bit. So if Munoz isn't careful, he could end up eating a knee from Pena. And I just feel that for Munoz to win, he'll have to accumulate considerable control time, to win on the judges' scorecards. And, I think Pena is going to be kind of difficult to hold or to take and hold down. Like I said before, Pena seems to have, decent scrambling. And in a lot of those situations, he could find himself taking the back of Munoz. He could, just end up backpacking him for a few rounds. And I do like the submissions and, jiu-jitsu of Pena, so he's definitely dangerous in the grappling department as well. So, I do slightly lean him a little more here, but if he isn't able to get out of those positions or is spending a little too much time on his back, I can see Munoz winning a decision. So, I do have a slight lean towards Pena, but I'm not super convinced that he can take it. While, Pena does have the UFC experience, he's really just fought super low level guys himself, and has honestly had a pretty unimpressive run in the UFC. Like, he's losing to guys like Matt Frivola and Kama Worthy. And then, he did beat Steve Garcia, who, was a short notice opponent. He ended up, backpacking this guy. And then Matt Wyman, coming off of a really long layoff, super old, and, is now retired once again. So, he's fought just very low level guys. So, not a lot of confidence in Pena at all. But I think he should be able to edge out the decision here. Slightly better striking, likely be able to scramble out of takedowns, not be held down for too long. So lean here is Pena, but not going to bet this at all. And up next we have Abdul Razak Alhassan versus Jacob Malkoun, and I'll keep this one pretty short because I think it's pretty straightforward, and this just feels like a squash match, honestly. Abdul Razak Alhassan, I mean, this guy is an absolute monster on the feet, very aggressive starter, throws bombs, very heavy hands, and he's been knocking guys out left and right in the UFC, but it looks like guys are starting to find the blueprint a bit on how to beat him. He starts off really aggressive and is extremely dangerous in that first round, but if you are able to weather the storm, he slows down pretty considerably and seems to have a very, very questionable defensive grappling game. So, yeah, if you're able to weather the early storm from him and take him down, the guy just gasses out, and you kind of just coast the rest of the fight. That said, though, I really don't think Jacob Malkoun is going to be the guy to do it. And, this guy, I kind of feel bad for him. It looks like, he is training partners with Whittaker, and, he got his UFC debut, I think as a favor for Whittaker, honestly, and they matched him up against Phil Hawes, who has got pretty heavy hands, and Hawes was able to get him out of there in like the first 20 seconds, I think. And, this is a pretty big step up in competition, in my opinion, with someone like Hawes, who, while he does have heavy hands, is primarily a wrestler, and, he was able to finish Malkoun pretty early in that fight. Alhassan, in my opinion, is a way more explosive, way more dangerous striker. Yeah, I think Malkoun might actually die in there. I mean, the guy made his UFC debut, with only 4 pro fights, fighting really, really low-level regional guys. And, yeah, I don't really think he belongs in there. I don't really see much from his game that would suggest he could beat, Alhassan. I guess the only way he could really do it is if he somehow is able to weather the early storm of Alhassan, maybe look to grapple with him. We have seen Malkoun, hit some offensive takedowns himself, but overall, I don't think he's able to weather the storm. I think if Phil Hawes was able to get the finish on him, Alhassan will have no issue finding the finish himself. I think that he's just going to be way too quick in there for him, way too explosive. I mean, I would even go as far as to say he's probably the more technical striker in there, even though he's just winging bombs, but I'd say he's got more striking experience than Malkoun. I think Malkoun's pretty outgunned here. I think outside of him just shooting for an early takedown, I don't see him really having any sort of success in this fight. I'm going to pick Alhassan here, and I'm probably going to take him first round knockout. The odds probably aren't going to be great on it, but if it's any sort of plus odds, I might just take a small shot on it because I think there's a good chance that Alhassan is able to finish Malkoun pretty early. So the pick here is Alhassan, and as far as the bet goes, I'm looking at the first round knockout prop, but again, the odds probably won't be great on it. And in the next fight, we have Andrei Arlovsky versus Chase Sherman, and kind of interesting that Arlovsky is coming in short notice to face Sherman here. Yeah, that kind of came out of the blue here, but taking a look at Chase Sherman first, I mean, I'm not very high on the guy. I don't think he's quite UFC level. I think he's got all the athletic, tools to do well, but technically he's just not very good. I mean, he's going around beating regional guys. He's coming off of a win against Ike Villanueva, who was completely undersized that fight. He's usually a light heavyweight, moving up to heavyweight that fight, and just really struggled to close the distance against Sherman. He was just throwing hooks too, so that wasn't helping. But Sherman was able to just kind of piece him up with a lot of the straight shots, and I think just clinch him up and honestly just overpower him in a lot of the clinch exchanges. But yeah, his striking isn't much to write home about. He's, very basic with his striking, not very layered. He's a bit hittable, has almost no head movement. He was getting clipped consistently, every time he'd enter, boxing range. So, yeah, not a very high level fighter, but, he's going to be the much younger fighter in this matchup. He's going to be, 32 or, yeah, no, 31, and, Arlovsky 42. I think Arlovsky, he is the much better fighter, but, at 42, it's just really hard to want to bet on him. But, as far as this matchup goes, he's going to have the better striking. I think he's going to have the better grappling too, but, he's going to be giving up a little bit of size. And, at 42, it's going to be really hard to have any confidence in, the chin of Arlovsky. He was rocked a bit in his previous fight against Tom Aspinall. Was able to, tough it out, but, Aspinall was able to get a really, not tricky, but, it was a very slick submission that he landed on him. But, Arlovsky, he's primarily a counterpuncher. I think that he should be able to land on Sherman anytime Sherman gets within distance or anytime he's throwing a punch. I think he'll find the mark on Sherman. So I think Arlovsky should take this. But, I don't think I'm going to touch this from a betting perspective. I was kind of hoping that, Arlovsky would come in as a dog. But, yeah, I think the bookies are kind of wise to it. I don't want to lay minus 175 on Arlovsky, even though I think he's the better fighter, more experience. So, yeah, I think Arlovsky should be able to touch Sherman up, but Arlovsky's pretty low volume himself, so there's a chance that this is going to be a very low-paced fight, not much going on, bit of a staring contest, in which case Sherman could potentially edge out a decision, but I'm going to side with Arlovsky. I think he's just the better fighter, so pick is Arlovsky, but definitely not looking to lay minus 175 on him. And in the co-main event, we have Jeremy Stephens versus Drakkar Klose. And right now, Stephens is sitting at minus 145. Comeback on Klose is plus 125. And let's start with Klose first. So I think I did a breakdown on him earlier, but I'll do it again. So on the feet, he is a bit flat-footed. It's kind of hard to get a good read on his striking, but he's got very loopy shots, but is able to find the mark on a lot of, I guess, these lower-level opponents. He's got a good body kick and head kick, but, he does leave himself open to a lot of counters as well because he throws a lot of these kicks naked. And, I think what usually wins him the fight, though, is his cage pushing and his ability to just kind of, grapple with opponents, kind of hold him there, and usually just win on some control time. But, this guy, he's not really winning his fights, decisively. He's a bit of a decisionator, and a lot of the time, he'll just look to box with opponents a little bit before eventually, pushing them up against the cage or looking to land a takedown to secure some control time. His opponent, Stephens, though, his striking is still pretty good in my opinion. Has fought just a ton of killers lately, and, he's been coming up short, but I'd say he's still given a pretty good account of himself in a lot of these fights. Like, he'll still come forward. He's still landing some pretty heavy shots on him, but I mean, he's been facing guys like Cater, Rodriguez, Magomed Sharapov, and Aldo. So I give him a bit of a pass on a lot of these fights because these guys are pretty high-level guys. I mean, these guys are at the top of the division. So this will be a pretty big step down in competition for Stephens. So, yeah, as far as, striking goes, he still does load up on a lot of his shots. Very much a headhunter. He will go to the body a bit, which, I would like to see more of because I remember in some of the other fights, he wasn't having a lot of success with his, headshots. So he started digging the body, and, that is definitely something he could go to against someone like Klose. But yeah, I see Stephens just having a pretty significant striking advantage. And as far as, his defensive grappling goes, he's not someone that's really easy to take and hold down. So I see Stephens just being able to outbox Klose and, staying off the fence, staying off the cage, and just winning honestly a pretty comfortable decision. He might even be able to get Klose out of there. We've seen Klose, he has been knocked out before. So yeah, definitely I do favor Stephens here. I'm going to go with Stephens. I've actually already put in a bet on him earlier. I believe 1.75 units at minus 125 when they first opened this fight up. It looks like a ton of money is starting to come in on Stephens. And, I do agree with it. I think Stephens should be able to beat Close, in the stand-up pretty handily. The only way I see Close winning this is if he's able to just grind on Stevens for 3 rounds, but I don't really see that happening. I mean, Stevens, he's been fighting, again, really high-level guys, and he's honestly given a pretty good account of himself in all those fights. And, hasn't shown too much of a decline either. He's still pretty durable. He ended up eating like a really nasty elbow from Cater that knocked him out, but, most guys are going to get put out with an elbow, so can't knock him too much there. But, as far as the pick goes, I'm going to go with Stevens here, and I already do have a bet placed on him. Robert Whittaker versus Kelvin Gastelum, and Whittaker was originally slated to go up against Costa, but Costa pulled out, and Gastelum is stepping in on short notice. Not as compelling of a matchup, but still an interesting one, all things considered. And let's take a look at Whittaker first. So he's got really good striking, in my opinion, and is honestly a pretty well-rounded fighter, I'd say. Definitely, the second best fighter in the division behind Adesanya. And, if it wasn't for Adesanya, I'd say he'd be a pretty dominant champ. But taking a look at what he does well, I mean, on the feet, he fights really well behind the jab, has good feints, really good footwork. He mixes up his strikes really well, and he's got good striking and takedown defense. We haven't really seen him use his offensive wrestling too much, but supposedly he does have a decent wrestling game and has competed, on the regional wrestling scene, I think. And, he did wrestle a little bit against Till. I think that's what really won him the fight in that last round when he was able to get Till to the ground. He's got pretty good fight IQ as well. He knows what he needs to do to win rounds, and he knows when he's up, when he's down, what he needs to do to secure the round. And that was really, I'd say, his veteran experience coming in that last round against Till in a fight that was pretty close up until that point. And something I do want to mention about Whittaker is just his heart and his toughness. I know in a lot of his fights he gets rocked and he gets hurt, but he's able to push through in a lot of those instances and is able to dig deep. So that was a bit of a concern going into his fight against Cannonier. I did eventually pick him and bet him against Cannonier, but that was always the concern with Whittaker, right, is that he might be chinny, but he's only been finished, twice in his career against Thompson and finished by knockout against Thompson and Adesanya. And these guys are high-level strikers, but in all of his other fights, he gets dropped, but he's able to come back. And I think that's something that gets a little overlooked with Whittaker. He's got the heart of a champion and just underrated toughness, in my opinion. But taking a look at Gastelum, I mean, he's got really good boxing. He's got a sneaky head kick for someone his size, right? You don't really expect someone of Gastelum's stature to be able to just land a head kick, but he was able to do it against Izzy and against a number of opponents. He's got good footwork, obviously really fast hands, just overall a really good striker. And in his last fight against Ian Heinisch, he did go to his wrestling a bit too, so there's always that for him to go to. And I did put a little bit on Heinisch by decision. I thought that Heinisch might be able to use his size a little bit more, but Gastelum really just showed that there were just levels to this game, and Heinisch just wasn't quite on that level yet. But as far as this matchup goes, I think Whittaker really is going to have to use his size a little bit to win this fight. I think if it's just a striking match, I think that Gastelum can absolutely make it close. He's got really good boxing on his end, and he might actually be able to beat Whittaker to the punch in a lot of exchanges. So I think the best path to victory for Whittaker is to just mix in the grappling and look to use his size and strength advantage to maybe just control Gastelum, because I think the fight will play out very close on the feet. Because if it's just a striking match, Gastelum can absolutely hang with some of the best strikers on the feet. I mean, this guy was able to go toe-to-toe with Izzy for, 4 rounds. So, yeah, I think Whittaker's going to have to look to mix it up, keep Gastelum guessing here. And, yeah, I think he should be able to coast to a decision here if he's able to use his wrestling effectively. But, yeah, I mean, I just favor Whittaker here. This guy's just been fighting the best of the best in the division for quite a while now. I mean, he's beaten guys like, Cannonier, Till, Romero twice, Souza, Brunson, Hall, Brad Tavares, just all these guys who are mainstays in the division. Whereas, with Gastelum, he's putting on some good fights, but, he's kind of come up short every time he's taken a step up in competition, or at least every time he's fought just the higher level guys like Adesanya, Till, Hermanson. This guy just hasn't been able to cut it at the higher level. I mean, he's got some good performances sprinkled in there, but Whittaker's just been consistently good at the top. So that's why I do favor Whittaker here, but I just feel the line is a little bit wide here at, Whittaker being, let's see, minus 250, so not as bad. I remember it opened up pretty high. There was points where he was like minus, I think 300 on certain books. So it felt a little wide there, but yeah, I think that my main concern is that if it is a striking fight, it'll be pretty close. Like even in his fight against Till, Whittaker, was barely able to scrape by. He barely won that, I'd say like 48-47. So, if he isn't able to go to his wrestling, it could be a very, very dicey matchup. But ultimately, I will side with Whittaker here. Like I said before, he's been getting it done. This guy is elite, and I don't want to, not going to pick against him here. I think he is, when it comes down to it, will be able to gut it out. So the pick here is Whittaker, and as much as I'd like to put him in a parlay or just play him straight, I think I might just pass on this fight and really just take it easy this whole card. I mean, not a lot of spots here to bet on, but as far as the pick goes, I'm just going to go with Whittaker, but yeah, likely going to pass on this fight. And that'll do it for this card. Unfortunately, not too many bets locked in for this one. Very, very tricky card in my opinion. Very low-level fights. And, as of right now, I only have one bet placed, and that's on the Stevens fight. I'm going to look to dig a little deeper on some of these fights. Maybe see if there are a few props that, I could play. But overall, just a very low-level card. Very high variance card in my opinion. Not a ton of tape on a lot of these guys. A lot of these guys are fighting really low-level fighters as well, so tough to get a really solid read on anyone. But yeah, I might dig a little deeper on some other fights to see if I could find some favorable props, but not going to look to force anything this week, especially since we'll have, UFC 261 the upcoming week, and, I think there are going to be some better spots on that card, so maybe just take it easy this card, save a bit of money, and then look to go a little harder on the upcoming card. So yeah, appreciate everyone who's made it here this far. Appreciate everyone who's watching these videos and liking and subscribing. It helps a lot. But yeah, that'll do it for this card, and I'll catch you guys next week.